They invited him to the anniversary party as an act of charity, and then they tore him apart right in front of hundreds of people. The man, who had worked for 30 years with calloused hands, raising his children alone since his wife's death, suddenly became a shame in the mouth of a billionaire who had never even touched motor oil. And his only son, the one whose tuition he had stayed up all night worrying about, stood there, silent, then turned and said, "You're no longer family." Like and comment on the city you're viewing from, so I know how far this story has come. And stay until the end, because no one can predict what happens next. I want to tell you something before I start. I'm not a man who cries easily. 30 years of crawling under rusted trucks, burning my knuckles on engine blocks, swallowing pride when customers talked down to me like I was something they'd scraped off their boot. That kind of life doesn't leave room for crying. You learn to compress things. You fold the hurt up small, tuck it somewhere behind your ribs, and you keep moving, because if you stop moving, everything falls apart. That's what I told myself, anyway. But the night my son looked me in the eye and said I was no longer his family, I felt something collapse inside me that no amount of compression could hold together. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The way old structures fail when the foundation finally gives. One moment everything is standing, and the next, it simply isn't. My name is Graham Holloway. I'm 63 years old. I ran a small engine repair shop for most of my adult life in a mid-sized Ohio town called Clover Falls, where the main street still has a hardware store and a diner that serves meatloaf on Thursdays. I'm the kind of man who knows every person at the gas station by name. The kind of man who fixed the widow carver's lawnmower for free every spring because she couldn't afford the parts. The kind of man who, I'm told, other people stopped noticing after a while. My son noticed me less and less once he married into money. That's the story, or part of it. The part that broke me open. The part that came after. That's what I'm still trying to make sense of. Evan was 26 when he met Lydia Ashcroft at a corporate networking event in Columbus. He'd been working in mid-level finance at a regional bank, pulling in decent money, wearing suits I helped him buy when he graduated college. He called me every Sunday back then, sometimes twice. We'd talk about the Browns, about his car needing new rotors, about whether he was eating enough vegetables, stupid, ordinary things that I now understand were the whole architecture of our relationship. The scaffolding. You never notice scaffolding until it's gone. Lydia was beautiful and sharp, and came from a world that had never once asked her to wait for anything. Her father, Victor Ashcroft, had built a financial empire across commercial real estate, private equity, and a handful of tech investments that had made him the kind of wealthy that stops feeling real, the kind of wealthy that turns into a personality. Victor Ashcroft didn't walk into rooms so much as he filled them. A big man with silver hair and a face permanently arranged into an expression that said he was already bored by whatever you were about to say. Evan and Lydia married 14 months after they met. I was at the wedding. I wore my good suit, the charcoal one I'd bought for a funeral 12 years earlier, and never found occasion to wear since. I sat in the fourth row, which I later learned was not where the important guests sat. I didn't know that at the time. Nobody told me. Victor Ashcroft shook my hand at the reception with the kind of grip that communicates nothing, looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, and then turned away to speak to a congressman. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I was wrong about that. And about a lot of other things. The changes in Evan came gradually, which is part of what made it so hard to name. First, the Sunday calls got shorter, then less frequent. By the second year of his marriage, I was lucky to reach him once a month. He was busy. That was always the explanation. New projects, travel, dinner engagements, obligations I didn't quite have the vocabulary for. I understood that his life had expanded into territory mine never had. I wasn't jealous of that. I'd worked hard enough for his opportunities that jealousy felt wrong. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to explain. Like watching a door slowly close and being too proud to put your foot in it. I tried visiting once, about 18 months in. I drove 4 hours to Columbus because Evan had mentioned offhandedly that they were settling into the new house. I brought a housewarming gift. A cast iron skillet I'd seasoned myself, good for another 40 years, the kind of thing his mother would have given. When I got there, Lydia answered the door in a way that suggested she'd been hoping for someone else. She was polite. She offered me water. She kept glancing at her phone. Evan came downstairs in a pressed shirt, and for just a moment, 1 second, his face did something unguarded, something almost like relief. Then it closed again. We sat in a kitchen that cost more than my entire shop and talked about nothing for 90 minutes. When I left, he walked me to my truck, and at the end of the driveway he said, "Dad, it means a lot that you came." He said it the way people say things they've practiced. I drove home with the skillet in the passenger seat because Lydia had said they'd already bought cookware. What? After that, I stopped trying as hard. Not out of anger. Not then. Not yet. But out of something closer to self-preservation. You can only reach for something so many times before the reaching itself starts to hurt. My shop kept me busy. My regulars kept me sane. There was old Pete Tanner, who brought in his 1987 F-150 so often it was practically a second home, and Donna Reyes, who always left a Tupperware of food on the front desk because she said I looked like a man who forgot to eat lunch. Small things. Ordinary kindnesses from ordinary people. I told myself that was enough. And then, 14 months after the visit to Columbus, I got a handwritten invitation to Victor Ashcroft's 20th anniversary gala, a celebration for Victor and his wife, Miriam, being held at a venue in downtown Columbus, so exclusive that the name meant nothing to me. I had to look it up online. The search results showed a ballroom with crystal chandeliers and a floor plan that seated 400 people. The invitation came from Evan. Handwritten note at the bottom. "Dad, we'd really love for you to be there. It would mean a lot. E." I held that note for a long time. I should have known, even then. I should have listened to whatever animal instinct was whispering at the back of my skull, the same instinct that had kept me alive under enough collapsed jacks and pressurized fuel lines that I'd lost count. Something didn't feel right. But I was Evan's father, and maybe this was the door opening again. Maybe this was the moment things returned to something I recognized. I pressed my good suit. I polished my shoes. I drove 4 hours. Bad. The venue was called the Meridian, and it was the kind of place that made men like me feel our own outsideness before we'd even stepped through the door. The valets didn't say anything unkind. They didn't have to. Their faces did it for them. That brief practice neutrality that communicates everything about where you belong and where you don't. Inside, 400 people moved through the ballroom in clusters of money and confidence. Women in gowns that probably cost more than my mortgage. Men in suits that had been tailored to their specific shoulders. A live quartet played something classical near the back wall. Waitstaff with white gloves carried champagne flutes on silver trays. I found the table with my name card. Table 14. Near the back, close to the kitchen doors, at a round table with people I'd never met. 3 couples who were introduced to me as regional affiliates of one of Victor's subsidiary companies. Nice enough people. Uncomfortable in the same way I was, which almost made me feel better. I didn't see Evan for the first 45 minutes. When I finally spotted him, he was across the room near the main table, laughing at something Victor was saying. He was comfortable there. Loose in his body in a way he hadn't been in my kitchen 2 years ago. He had Victor's ease now, or he was performing it well enough that the difference didn't matter. Lydia stood at his side in a deep blue gown, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow. I raised my hand. He saw me. I know he saw me. His eyes moved across my face for half a second and then redirected, smooth as water around a stone. I put my hand down. The dinner was served in courses. I ate without tasting anything. Victor's remarks came just after the 3rd course. A speech about 20 years of marriage, about building something worth keeping, about the Ashcroft name and what it stood for. He was practiced and commanding at the podium, the room arranged around him like planets around a sun. He made people laugh. He made Miriam tear up. He told a story about the early years, about risk and sacrifice, about what legacy meant to him. I was almost moved by it, which tells you something about how good he was. Then, just before he wrapped up, He looked out across the room with an expression of expansive generosity and said, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the family connections we've built through Evan and Lydia's marriage. Both families. He smiled. Some connections enrich us. Some... He paused, and the pause had a shape to it, a theatrical precision. Some remind us of how far we've come. There was soft laughter, the kind that comes from people who understand exactly what's being said without needing the words to be clear. He looked at table 14. He looked at me. The smile didn't change. I believe Evan's father is with us tonight, a mechanic, I understand. From another pause, another performance, Clover Falls. He said the name of my town the way you might describe a minor inconvenience on your daily commute. Graham, was it? Thank you for making the drive. Scattered, uncertain applause. We appreciate the effort it must have taken. The room laughed again, louder this time. My face went hot, not from embarrassment, or not only from embarrassment, from the specific searing shame of being made into a punchline in front of 400 strangers while my son sat 20 feet away and did nothing. I didn't look at Evan. I couldn't. I picked up my water glass. I set it down. I breathed. The speech ended. The dessert arrived. Around me, conversation resumed its polished, confident flow. The people at my table pretended not to have noticed, which was its own particular cruelty. And then Evan appeared. He came around the edge of the tables without Lydia, and he had his phone in his hand like a man who might need an exit. He sat down in the empty chair beside me that one of the affiliate couples had vacated. Hey, he said. Hey, I said. We sat with that for a moment. Victor was just being, he started. Don't, I said, quietly. He stopped, worked something in his jaw. Dad? I drove 4 hours, I said. I pressed this suit. I don't own another one. I've been sitting at table 14 next to the kitchen for 2 hours, and your father-in-law just used me as a joke to make his friends laugh. I wasn't raising my voice. I'm not a man who raises his voice in public. And I looked across the room at you, and you were laughing too. I wasn't laughing at you. You were laughing, Evan. His jaw tightened. Something shifted in his eyes, and a decision being made, or a decision that had already been made and was only now being surfaced. Look, I know tonight wasn't... It's complicated. Victor has a way of... Are you going to apologize to him? I asked. Or to me? Silence. He embarrassed me, I said. In front of 400 people. Your family, your friends, the people you want to impress. And you sat there. Dad, I can't just... He stopped himself, looked at the tablecloth. When he looked back up, his expression had gone somewhere flat and decided. I can't keep mediating between you and Victor. It's not sustainable. I've built something here. I've built a life. And every time I try to bridge the gap, it's... He exhaled. It's not working. You don't fit into this world, Dad. I'm sorry, but you don't. I looked at my son's face. The face I'd watched come into being. The face I'd held still when he was 7 and a fishhook caught his cheek and I had to keep him calm while I drove to the emergency room. The face I'd watched cross a stage in a cap and gown while I stood in the back of an auditorium, crying for the first time in 12 years. You don't fit into this world. You're my son, I said. My voice was steady. I can be proud of that, at least. I'm your father. That's not a world. That's a fact. Dad, what you're describing, I said slowly, is choosing. You know that. He looked at me. He was going to say something reasonable, something measured, something that would allow him to leave this table without having to own the full weight of what he was doing. I could see him assembling it. Instead, Victor appeared at Evan's shoulder. He hadn't been invited. He was just there, materializing the way powerful men do when they sense a negotiation happening without them. He placed one hand on Evan's shoulder, a gesture of ownership so casual it probably didn't even register to Victor himself as what it was. Everything all right here? Victor asked pleasantly, looking at me with that arranged face, that permanent, comfortable boredom. Evan straightened slightly. The straightening was involuntary. It was muscle memory. It was who he'd become. Fine, Evan said. We were just finishing up. Victor nodded. Your mother's looking for you. Something about the photographer. And he moved away, his work done. Evan he stood up from the chair, and he didn't look at me right away. He was smoothing the front of his jacket, getting himself organized. Then he looked at me. I think, he started. Don't, I said again. He stopped. And then, and I want you to understand that I heard this clearly enough that it will probably be with me until the last day I have, he said quietly, almost gently, the way you might tell someone that their coat has been given to the wrong person at the coat check. You're not my family anymore, Dad. I'm sorry. He walked back across the room, back to the main table, back to Lydia, who touched his arm when he returned, back to Victor, who said something in his ear that made Evan nod twice, back to the life he had chosen. I sat at table 14 for a while after that. I don't know how long. Long enough for the dessert plates to be cleared. Long enough for the quartet to start a second set. Then I stood up, straightened my suit jacket, the one with the loose button on the left cuff that I'd been meaning to fix, and I walked out of the Meridian with my head up. Gukong. I drove home in the dark. 4 hours. The radio went in and out. Somewhere around the second hour, in a stretch of highway with no lights and nothing on either side but flat Ohio farmland, I pulled over. I sat there with the engine running, and I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I breathed. I am not going to tell you I didn't feel it. I did. I felt the whole weight of it. 30 years. The diapers and the sick nights and the homework and the fights over curfew and the college application essays I proofread at midnight. The fishing trips that were mostly just the two of us sitting in comfortable silence. The day his mother died, the way he came apart, and the way I held him together, and the private decision I made in that hospital waiting room that I would never let him feel alone as long as I was breathing. I felt all of it, there on the side of that highway. And then I pulled back onto the road. Because what else do you do? What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I was not alone in that ballroom. Someone else had been watching. Not Lydia. Not one of the affiliate couples from Table 14. Not one of Victor's board associates or college friends or golf partners. Someone who had been watching me specifically for longer than I knew. Someone who had built a quiet life into a substantial one, in exactly the same way I had tried to. With work and patience and a set of values that didn't bend when things got comfortable. Someone who had spent decades assessing the character of the people around her and had reached conclusions about most of them that were, I would later learn, almost entirely correct. Her name was Margaret Ellison. I hadn't spoken to Margaret in nearly 3 years. She was my mentor, though I never called her that out loud, the kind of word that embarrassed both of us. I'd known her since I was 19, when she owned the building where I rented my first garage bay. She was sharp and economical with her words, and she had a way of watching you that made you feel seen in a way that was not always entirely comfortable. She'd followed my life loosely for decades. A letter here, a phone call there, a birthday card every year that arrived on time because Margaret Ellison was the kind of woman who tracked things. I didn't know she had been at the Meridian that night. She attended in the capacity of someone invited to someone else's table, a connection through one of Victor's business interests, I'd learn later. She would not have sought me out. That wasn't her style. But she saw me. And she made a decision. I got back to Clover Falls at 2 a.m. I unlocked the shop, went to the small office in the back, and sat at the metal desk where I'd done 30 years of invoices and tax filings and parts orders. The desk my wife had painted blue because she said the gray made it look like a morgue. I sat there for a while. I wasn't thinking about revenge. That came later, and not in the way you might expect. What I was thinking about was Monday. Whether Pete Tanner was bringing in the F-150 or the Silverado. Whether the compressor in the lift bay needed a new belt. Whether Donna was going to remember to drop off those brake caliper seals she'd ordered. The small things. The scaffolding of my actual life. I went home. I slept, which surprised me. I woke up at 5:30, which was normal, and made coffee and fed the cat, an overweight orange thing named Rusty, who had shown up in the shop 8 years ago and refused to leave. And I went to work. I did not cry until I was in the shower 3 days later. And even then, it was more like a pressure release than grief. The kind of crying where you're not entirely sure what you're crying for because there's too much of it to name. But I want to be honest with you about one thing. When I walked out of the Meridian that night, I was not a man who had been destroyed. I was a man who had been clarified. There's a difference, and it matters, because what I had just lost was something I'd been holding on to out of habit more than truth. The idea that my son would come back. The idea that the distance was temporary. The idea that blood was its own kind of gravity, pulling you back no matter how far you drifted. He had told me clearly. He had chosen, and he had named his choice, and there was a brutal mercy in that. The mercy of knowing where you actually stand instead of spending years in the fog of wondering. I had my shop. I had Rusty. I had Pete Tanner's terrible truck and Donna Reyes's cooking and a town that knew my name for reasons that had nothing to do with money. I had my hands and my work and my conscience. And somewhere, driving home from the Meridian in a car I'd never tell you the make of because she would have been embarrassed by the attention, Margaret Ellison was thinking about me. I didn't know that yet, but I would. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself back into the shop with the kind of focus that comes from having nothing else to redirect your energy toward. I took on jobs I might have turned away before. The complicated ones, the ones other shops had already given up on. An antique Indian motorcycle that needed an engine rebuild from scratch. A fleet of landscaping trucks with electrical gremlins so persistent the owner had started to believe it was personal. I worked long days. I ate lunch at my desk. I watched the news at night without really watching it, and went to bed at 10, and woke at 5 and started again. I did not contact Evan. He did not contact me. The silence between us had a shape now, a clean edge, instead of the ragged, uncertain border of before. I won't tell you it didn't hurt. It hurt the way a set bone hurts, like constantly, but with the particular quality of something that is at least properly aligned now, something that has a chance of healing correctly. I told one person what had happened, Donna Reyes, because she showed up at the shop 11 days after the gala with a pot of chili and a look on her face that said she already knew something was wrong and was going to sit there until I told her what it was. I told her the basics. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Donna. When I finished, she sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "You raised a boy who knew how to be loved, Graham. What he does with that is on him now." I thought about that for a long time. Done. The letter came on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the gala. It was formal, proper letterhead, thick cream paper, the kind of stationery that signals seriousness before you've read a word. From a law firm in Columbus, Hartwell, Cates, and Simmons, attorneys at law. The name meant nothing to me. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, still in my work clothes. It requested my presence at their offices the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning in connection with the estate of Margaret Ellison, deceased. I read it twice. Margaret. I sat down. Margaret Ellison had died, the letter said, 8 days ago. Quietly, at home, the way she had lived, without spectacle, without announcement. She had been 81 years old. She had no surviving family. I hadn't known she was sick. The last time we'd spoken was a brief phone call the previous winter, during which she told me she was fine, Graham, stop hovering, and asked about the shop. She had not mentioned illness. She had not mentioned anything unusual. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with that letter in my hands. I had lost, in the space of 6 weeks, the two people who had mattered most to me. One by his own choice, one by God's. Only I don't talk about God, so let's say one by the ordinary cruelty of time. I drove to Columbus that Tuesday, a different kind of drive than the one to the Meridian. Same highway, same flat Ohio farmland, same radio drifting in and out, but a different quality to the air inside the truck. The offices of Hartwell, Cates, and Simmons were on the 14th floor of a downtown building with a lobby that smelled like old money and good leather. A young associate led me to a conference room and brought coffee I didn't touch. The attorney who handled Margaret's estate was named Richard Cates. He was somewhere in his 60s, silver at his temples, with the particular energy of someone who had carried large, quiet responsibilities for a long time and had learned to do it without visible effort. He set a folder on the table. He did not open it immediately. "Mr. Holloway," he said. Before we begin, I want to ask, how much did you know about Margaret Ellison's financial situation? I turned that question over for a moment. She was comfortable, I said. That was my impression. She owned property. I assumed she'd done well. Richard Cates nodded once, the nod of a man confirming something he expected. She had done more than well, he said. Considerably more. He opened the folder. Evening. What came next will take more than one sitting to fully tell. But I want you to understand where I was, standing on the edge of that conference room table, before I understood what it meant. I was a 63-year-old mechanic from Clover Falls, Ohio. My net worth, the shop, the equipment, the house my wife had chosen, and I had kept because I couldn't bring myself to change it, came to somewhere in the low six figures if you were being optimistic. I owed 18 months on a truck. I had a savings account that I thought of as responsible and probably anyone else would have called modest. I had been publicly humiliated 6 weeks ago by a man who believed wealth was a form of character. I had been told by my only child that I was not his family, and I was sitting in a leather chair on the 14th floor of a Columbus law office, about to learn something that would change the texture of everything I thought I understood about my own life. Not because I had done anything to deserve it, because Margaret Ellison had watched me for 40 years and decided that I was the kind of man she wanted standing in her corner when she was gone. She had been watching all of us, apparently, and she had reached her conclusions. I held my coffee cup in both hands and I listened, and what Richard Cates told me next? Well, that's where the story really starts. Richard Cates didn't rush it. That was the first thing I noticed. He had the particular stillness of a man who understood that what he was about to say needed room around it. He poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. He straightened the folder once, unnecessarily. Then he looked at me across the conference table with an expression I didn't quite have a name for at the time, somewhere between gravity and something that might have been respect. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "Margaret Ellison's estate has been in preparation for nearly 7 years. She was meticulous about this. There were no accidents in how she structured it, and there were no afterthoughts. Every decision she made was deliberate." He paused. "Including you." "I'm not sure I follow," I said. "You are the sole beneficiary of her estate," Richard Cates said. "Everything, in its entirety." I heard the words. I understood them individually, but for a moment they didn't connect into meaning, the way sometimes you can read a sentence 3 times and still feel nothing land. "That can't be right," I said. "It is right. She had connections, colleagues, people she'd worked with for decades. She was involved in half a dozen organizations. She considered all of them," he said. "She considered them carefully and at length. And she chose you." He opened the folder properly now, turning it toward me so I could see the first page. "She left written explanations for each decision. That was very much like her. I think you'd agree." I looked at the page. Margaret's handwriting, angular, precise, the same handwriting that had been on every birthday card for 40 years, filled the top portion of a separate document clipped to the legal paperwork. I couldn't read it from that angle. I wasn't sure I was ready to. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. Because I'm a practical man, and at some point practical questions are the only ones your brain can manage, Richard Cates told me. I sat back in my chair. He waited. "That's not possible," I said. "It is," he said. Margaret was a private investor for most of her adult life. Extremely private. She had a gift for identifying undervalued assets, companies, real estate, agricultural operations, before they became what they eventually became. She also had a gift, apparently, for ensuring that almost no one knew how much she'd accumulated. He allowed himself a small expression that wasn't quite a smile. "I've been an estate attorney for 31 years. Margaret Ellison is the most financially significant client I've had, who nobody had ever heard of." The number he'd given me was not millions. It was significantly more than millions. It included a portfolio of 7 companies in various states of operation, 3 working ranches across 2 states, a commercial real estate holding in Cincinnati, and a set of investment accounts that had been compounding quietly for the better part of 4 decades. The total valuation, conservatively assessed, exceeded what I would later understand to be the rough net worth of Victor Ashcroft's entire business empire at its recent peak. I pressed my hands flat on the table, felt the cool of the wood grain against my palms. She was testing people, I said slowly. It wasn't a question. The idea had arrived fully formed, the way sometimes understanding does when the pieces were already there and just needed the right moment to arrange themselves. Richard nodded. In a manner of speaking, she was observant, yes. She paid close attention to character over time. She was particularly interested in how people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. He paused. She mentioned you specifically in her personal notes, Mr. Holloway. She said, and I'm reading directly here, Graham Holloway never once asked me for anything. In 40 years, he never once positioned himself for advantage. He fixed my gutters because they needed fixing, not because he expected something in return. That is rarer than people understand. I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. 40 years ago, I'd fixed Margaret Ellison's gutters because it was October, and she was standing under a ladder that was too short, and I'd been walking past, and the whole situation looked like it was going to end badly. I hadn't thought about it in decades. She watched me for 40 years based on gutters, I said. The gutters were the beginning, Richard said. She followed your life, at a distance, but consistently. She knew about your wife's illness. She knew about your son's education. She was aware you'd taken a second mortgage on the shop to cover his first year of college, which you apparently never told him. He looked at me steadily. She knew about the Meridian. I went still. She was there that night, Richard said, a guest at one of the secondary tables. She saw what happened. She saw how you conducted yourself afterward. He paused. Her handwritten addendum to the main will was dated the following morning. Apparently she had been considering the final structure of the estate for some time, but that night confirmed something for her. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what there was to say. She wrote, Richard continued, and now he was reading again from the clipped document. I have watched Graham Holloway be diminished by smaller men for a very long time. He has never diminished himself in return. He walked out of that room with more dignity than everyone else in it combined. He is the right person to carry what I've built because he will carry it the right way. The room was very quiet. Outside, 14 floors down, Columbus went about its ordinary Thursday. Somewhere in this same city, in an office I could probably have located on a map, Evan was at his desk doing whatever it was Evan did now. Somewhere further north, in a building whose name I'd had to look up, Victor Ashcroft was being Victor Ashcroft. And I was sitting in a leather chair with a dead woman's faith in me resting across my shoulders like something I hadn't earned and wasn't sure I knew how to hold. I need to think, I said. Of course. I can't make any kind of decision about this today. That's completely understandable, Richard said. There's no immediate urgency in terms of the operational assets. Everything is being managed by existing staff and contracted administrators. What matters right now is that you understand what's been entrusted to you and that you have access to the full picture before you decide anything. He closed the folder with quiet care. I'd also like you to read her letter, the full one. She wrote it to you personally, not as part of the legal documentation, just as a letter. He slid a sealed envelope across the table, my name on the front in that angular, precise handwriting. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected, which seemed wrong for something this heavy. Can I ask you something? I said. Of course. Did she have anyone? At the end, was she alone? Richard Cates looked at me for a moment. She had home care in the last few months, professional staff, but family. No. No one visited to my knowledge. He paused. She didn't seem to want visitors. She was self-contained, I think is the word. She seemed at peace with her own company. I nodded. That sounded like Margaret. It also broke my heart a little, quietly. The way things break when you're not entirely surprised. I drove back to Clover Falls without opening the letter. I'm not sure why. Some instinct that said I needed to be home when I read it. In my own kitchen, with Rusty on my lap, and the specific, unremarkable safety of my own walls around me. I got back at 3 p.m. I fed the cat. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd opened the legal letter a week ago, and I read what Margaret had left me. I'm not going to repeat everything she wrote. Some of it is private, and she deserved at least that much. The privacy of words she intended for one person. But I'll tell you this much, she was not sentimental exactly. The letter was not flowery. It didn't try to explain or justify what she'd done in elaborate terms. What she said, essentially, was this. She said she had spent her life watching people misunderstand the relationship between money and character. She had watched people believe that wealth conferred worth, and that poverty or ordinariness was a kind of moral failing. She had watched this belief destroy families, corrode friendships, turn decent people into instruments of their own worst instincts. She said she had built what she'd built because she was good at it, and because she enjoyed the puzzle of it, but also because she'd always believed that resources in the right hands could function as a form of justice. Not dramatic justice, quiet justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She said she had chosen me because I was the only person in her long life of careful observation who had never once, not once, behaved as though she owed him anything. And in a world that had taught her to expect exactly the opposite, that had meant everything. She said one more thing, near the end, that I read 3 times before I put the letter down. She said, "Graham, I know you'll want to refuse this. I know it will feel wrong, or unearned, or like something that belongs to someone else. You've spent 60 years believing that men like you don't get to have things like this. I'm asking you to be wrong about that, just this once. I'm asking you to receive something, not for yourself. I know you well enough to know that won't be enough. Do it for the people you can reach with it. There are more of them than you know." I sat at that table for a long time. Rusty climbed onto my lap, which he only did when he sensed something was wrong. Or maybe he just wanted the warmth. With cats, it's hard to know. I called Richard Cates the next morning and told him I would accept. He said, "She said you would, eventually. She said it would take you one night." She had known me better than I knew myself. I found that both comforting and slightly infuriating, which I suspected was also exactly right. Okay. What followed over the next several weeks was not triumphant. I want to be honest about that. Taking possession of an inheritance of that scale is not a clean cinematic event. It is paperwork and meetings and an overwhelming volume of information arriving from people who know things you don't about industries you've never worked in. It is learning, at 63, to sit in rooms where people speak a financial language you're not fluent in and asking questions that make you feel slow, and doing it anyway because the alternative is pretending to understand and making decisions from ignorance. I brought in a financial advisor, a woman named Patricia Voss who came recommended by Richard Cates, and who had the particular quality of being able to explain complex things without making you feel stupid for not already knowing them. Our first meeting lasted 4 hours. I took notes on a legal pad, the same kind I used for shop estimates, and she didn't comment on that. "The priority is the operating companies," Patricia told me in our second meeting. 3 of them have leadership in place who knew Margaret and who are managing well. 2 are in transition, and 1, she paused, pulling up a document on her laptop. 1 has been attracting outside attention in the last few weeks. What kind of attention? A competitor. Someone who's been watching the company's leadership transition and has apparently concluded that the instability represents an acquisition opportunity. She turned the laptop toward me. "Do you know the name Ashcroft Capital Management?" I looked at the screen for a long moment. I am not a man who believes in coincidence as a category. Things happen or they don't. Causes produce effects. But sitting in Patricia Voss's conference room, looking at the name of my son's father-in-law on a document describing a hostile acquisition attempt against a company I now owned, I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Tell me exactly what's happening," I said. Patricia pulled up a second document. "Ashcroft Capital has been making quiet moves over the past 3 weeks, purchasing small positions, reaching out to some of the company's secondary shareholders. The strategy is a slow encirclement. They're betting on continued leadership instability, and they're expecting weak resistance." She paused. "They don't know yet who the new ownership structure is. Margaret's estate has been sealed while the transfer processes. Publicly, the company still shows as being in an estate transition without named beneficiaries. So Victor doesn't know it's me." "Victor doesn't know it's anyone specific," she said. "He's circling what he believes is essentially a wounded animal." I sat with that for a long moment. "Here's what I want to tell you, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumph. Not yet. What I felt was something more complicated. A tightening in my chest that was partly about Victor, yes, but was also about Evan and about Margaret and about the gutters and about a dinner table 14 floors beneath everything that meant anything, and about a woman who had died alone in a house somewhere in Columbus, having spent her last several months making sure that what she'd built would land in hands she trusted. I felt the weight of all of that. And underneath it, quiet and cold and clear as well water, I felt something else beginning, not revenge. That's not the right word, and I'm careful about words when it matters. Something more like refusal. A refusal to keep being what Victor Ashcroft had decided I was. A mechanic from nowhere, a punchline, a thing to be moved around or used up or set aside. A refusal to let what Margaret had trusted me with be consumed by the same casual arrogance that had turned my son into someone I no longer recognized. "What do I need to do?" I asked Patricia. She looked at me across the table. She had seen enough in her career to have a reasonable sense of when people were serious and when they were performing seriousness. She must have seen something in my face that told her the difference. "First," she said, "we need to finish the formal transfer. That establishes you legally and unambiguously as the owner of record. Once that's complete and registered, any acquisition attempt hits a wall. You are not a seller, and a private majority owner who doesn't want to sell cannot be forced out through a minority shareholder strategy." She paused. "Second, we reach out quietly to the key shareholders Ashcroft has been approaching. We don't alarm them. We just clarify that the ownership question has been settled and the transition is stable. And if Victor escalates before the transfer is finalized, then we have contingency measures." She said it without drama. Margaret anticipated this possibility. There are provisions in her estate structure specifically designed to prevent acquisition during the transition period. She was thorough. I thought about Margaret Ellison, 81 years old, dying quietly, writing provisions into a legal document to protect companies she would never see again from people she had apparently spent a lifetime understanding better than they understood themselves. "She really was something," I said. "From everything I've seen in this file," Patricia said carefully, "she absolutely was." The formal transfer completed on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 2 days after my first meeting with Richard Cates. I signed a volume of documents that took most of a morning. Afterward, I drove back to Clover Falls and opened the shop. Pete Tanner was there when I pulled in, sitting in his F-150 with the window down and a thermos of coffee in his hand. "You're late," he said. "I was signing some paperwork," I said. "What kind of paperwork takes until 10:30? "The boring kind," I said. "Come inside. What's wrong with the truck this time?" He complained about a shimmy in the front end for 20 minutes while I pulled the wheels and found what was wrong, which was something simple, always something simple with Pete's truck. And we talked about the Browns and whether the diner's new cook was as good as the old one and whether the winter was going to be early this year. I fixed the truck. I charged him the normal rate. He left his thermos by accident and I put it on the shelf where I kept the things people forgot, which was already fairly crowded. It was an ordinary day. It was a completely ordinary day. And that ordinariness felt, I realized, like its own kind of answer, like proof of something I hadn't been sure of, standing in the parking lot of the Meridian 6 weeks ago, still feeling the heat in my face and the specific silence of a son walking away. I was still myself. Entirely. All the way through. What had changed was only this. I had resources now. Real ones. And I had a dead woman's trust and a promise I'd made to use both of them the way she would have wanted. I didn't know yet what that was going to cost. But Victor Ashcroft was circling. I could feel it even from Clover Falls. That particular quality of predatory patience that powerful men develop when they believe they've found something undefended. He was very wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. And somewhere in Columbus, in a pressed suit at a desk in a building with a name on it, my son was going about his day entirely unaware that the story he thought he'd finished writing had just been given a second act. The first move Victor made wasn't loud. That's what I want you to understand about men like him. They don't announce themselves until they're certain. They probe. They test the edges. They send people ahead of them to check the ground, the way you'd test ice before walking on it. Patricia called me on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the transfer completed. while I was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild. I had grease on both arms up to the elbow and a shop rag tucked into my belt, and I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. They moved on the Hargrove shareholders, she said. There was a sharpness in her voice that I'd learned to recognize as her version of urgency. Controlled, precise, but present. Ashcroft Capital reached out directly to 3 of the secondary holders yesterday afternoon. They're offering a 15% premium on current valuation. I set down the part I was holding. How did they get the shareholder list? It's partially a matter of public record at that level. They didn't need inside access. They just needed patience and a good research team. She paused. But here's what's interesting. Their offer letter references the company as being in ongoing ownership uncertainty. Someone has been feeding them information, or they believe the estate transfer is still incomplete. It completed 11 days ago. Yes, but the public filing takes time to process. There's a window and they're using it. Another pause. Graham, I need to know. How do you want to play this? I wiped my hands on the shop rag and walked to the back office, where it was quiet. I sat at the blue desk, my wife's blue desk, and I thought for a moment. Here's the thing about being a mechanic for 30 years. You learn to diagnose before you act. You learn that the sound an engine makes is telling you something specific, and that throwing parts at it without listening first wastes money and time and usually makes the problem worse. You learn patience as a professional tool. We don't announce anything yet, I said. Let them keep going. Let them make their full approach to those 3 shareholders. When they've committed to the strategy, when Victor has resources in motion and expectations set with his board, that's when we file the transfer and respond to the shareholders directly. Silence on the line for a moment. That's a risk, Patricia said carefully. If any of the 3 shareholders accept the offer before we reach them, then we deal with that when it happens. But I don't think they will. Margaret built loyalty with those people. She invested in them when they were small. They're not going to move in 11 days for a 15% premium from someone they don't know. I paused. How long before the public filing processes? 6 to 8 days, optimistically. Then we wait, I said. And in the meantime, I want to know everything there is to know about Victor Ashcroft's current financial position. Not the public version, the real one. Another pause. I know someone, Patricia said finally, a forensic financial analyst. She's done work for us before on complex estate litigation. If there's something in Ashcroft's books that doesn't match the surface, she'll find it. Get her started, I said. I picked up the shop rag again and stood up from the blue desk. I've got a transmission to finish. So, what Sandra Ortega, the forensic analyst, found over the following 10 days arrived in pieces, each one slightly worse than the last, the way bad news tends to when there's a lot of it to deliver. Victor Ashcroft's public image was one of consolidation and strength, a man who had built his fortune carefully and was now in the comfortable position of expansion from a position of security. That was the story his press team maintained, and it was the story most people in his financial orbit had accepted without examination. The truth, as Sandra laid it out across 3 meetings in Patricia's office, was considerably different. Victor had overextended himself across 4 major real estate acquisitions in the previous 18 months, betting on an interest rate trajectory that had not materialized. He had also personally guaranteed a debt instrument for one of his subsidiary companies, a guarantee that was now being called in ahead of schedule due to a covenant default. He was not in freefall, not yet, but he was carrying a debt load that required consistent cash flow from his operating assets to service, and if any significant portion of that cash flow was disrupted, the structural fragility of the whole arrangement would become visible to his investors. He needed the Hargrove acquisition to generate a fast return. He needed it to work, and to work quickly, in a way that he could show his board before the Q4 disclosures. Sandra set down her last document across the table and looked at me. She was a compact woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the direct, unimpressed manner of someone who had spent decades looking at the gap between what people claimed and what was actually true. If the Hargrove acquisition fails, she said, he doesn't collapse immediately, but it removes a significant piece of what he's been using to project stability to his institutional investors. And if those investors start looking more carefully at the overall position, she shrugged. Dominoes. I sat with that for a moment. He went after what he thought was a weak target, I said. He went after what he thought was an undefended one, Sandra corrected. There's a difference. He didn't think it was weak. He thought no one was home. I nodded slowly. And now someone is. She looked at me steadily. Now someone is. The public filing processed on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, the three shareholders Ashcroft Capital had approached had all received direct communication from Patricia's office on my behalf. Not aggressive, not dramatic. Simply factual. The ownership transition was complete. The company had a clear and committed new majority owner, and there was no uncertainty to exploit. We included a copy of the filed transfer documents. All three called back within 48 hours. None of them were selling. I found out later from one of the shareholders who became someone I genuinely liked, a woman named Carol Jeffries, who had run a logistics operation for 30 years and had Margaret's kind of directness, that Ashcroft Capital had called her again after our communication. Trying to re-engage, offering a higher premium. What did you tell them? I asked her when we finally met in person 2 weeks later. I told them I don't negotiate with people who wait until a woman has been dead 3 weeks before trying to pick the bones, Carol said flatly. And then I hung up. I liked Carol Jeffries considerably after that. Victor's next move surprised me, which I'll admit freely. I hadn't expected him to escalate. Not so quickly, not with his financial position as fragile as Sandra had described. But Patricia called me on a Monday with a quality in her voice I hadn't heard before, something slightly tighter than her usual controlled urgency. Ashcroft Capital has filed a legal challenge, she said. They're contesting the estate transfer on procedural grounds. They're claiming there were irregularities in the original will execution that render the beneficiary designation invalid. I stood very still in the middle of my shop floor. Around me, the ordinary sounds of the place. The compressor cycling, a radio playing country music from somewhere in the back bay, Rusty asleep on the parts catalog where he always slept when the weather turned cold. Can they do that? I asked. Anyone can file a legal challenge, Patricia said. Whether it has merit is a different question. Richard Cates says the will is airtight. Margaret used one of the most experienced estate attorneys in Ohio for the original preparation, and Richard's firm has handled the execution meticulously. There are no procedural irregularities. What Ashcroft is doing is buying time and generating uncertainty. A contested estate creates complications for the operating companies. Investors get nervous. Leadership gets distracted. If they can manufacture enough instability, it starts to look like the acquisition offer is actually the stabilizing option. That's cynical, I said. That's strategy, she said. Graham, this is going to get harder before it gets easier. I want you to be prepared for that. I know, I said. What I didn't say, because it wasn't Patricia's business, I was also trying to figure out how much Evan knew about this. That question answered itself 9 days later. My phone rang on a Sunday evening, the time he used to call, back when he called. I was in the kitchen. The name on the screen was still listed as Evan because I hadn't changed it, and I didn't know why I hadn't changed it. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Dad? His voice was tighter than I remembered, stressed in a specific way that took me back to when he was 19 and had wrecked my truck and didn't know how to tell me. I need to talk to you. Okay? I said. I didn't make it easier for him. I sat down at the kitchen table and I waited. I heard... He stopped, started again. I heard about the Hargrove thing, about Margaret Ellison's estate. I waited. I didn't know, he said. About you being named. I swear I didn't know about that when... He stopped again. Dad, I'm sorry. About the Meridian. About what I said. I've been trying to figure out how to... Evan. My voice came out quieter than I intended, which was probably better. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. A pause. Okay? Did Victor send you to make this call? Silence. Long enough to be its own answer. It's not like... He started. Did he? Another silence. Smaller this time. He suggested that maybe I should reach out, that maybe some things could be resolved between us. He exhaled. But, Dad, I also genuinely, stop, I said. He stopped. I love you, I said. And I meant it, which was the hardest part. The fact that I still meant it, even now, even with his father-in-law's legal team trying to unwind the life of a dead woman who had been kinder to me than my own son. I love you the same way I always have. That hasn't moved, but I need you to hear something clearly. I paused to make sure I had the words right. Whatever I have or don't have has nothing to do with what happened at the Meridian. Those are separate things. What happened at that table happened before any of this, and it happened because of choices you made. Not because of money, not because of Victor, because of you. I kept my voice level. I'm not going to let you apologize to me because your father-in-law is in trouble, and suddenly my forgiveness has strategic value. That's not how this works. Silence on the line. When Evan spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Some of the tightness had a different quality to it now, something rawer underneath. Do you think I don't know that? He said, and the rawness surprised me. Do you think I don't know exactly what I did? I've known since before I walked back to that table. A pause. I keep seeing your face, when you were just sitting there, after Victor's speech. You didn't even... He stopped. You just sat there. You didn't yell. You didn't make a scene. You just sat there with your water glass and your face. He couldn't finish it. I didn't fill the silence for him. That wasn't cruelty. That was honesty. He needed to sit in it. I can't fix it with a phone call, he said finally. I know that. No, I said. You can't. Then what do I do? I don't know, I said. That's yours to figure out. But I'll tell you this. Whatever you decide, make sure it's yours, not Victor's, not Lydia's. Yours. I paused. Because the thing you traded away was the version of yourself that made decisions for your own reasons, and you can't get that back by making another decision for someone else's. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know if I still have that version, he said quietly. Neither do I said honestly. But that's what you'd have to find out. I ended the call. I sat for a while. Rusty appeared from somewhere and sat on my feet, which was unusual for him, and I appreciated it more than I'll admit to most people. The legal challenge ran into trouble almost immediately. Margaret's team had been too thorough, the documentation too precise, every procedural step verified and witnessed and time-stamped with the kind of meticulous care that comes from an attorney who knows the will is going to be challenged and has prepared for exactly that. Richard Cates moved through Victor's objections with the patient efficiency of someone dismantling a structure that was never going to hold. But the challenge had done its damage. 2 weeks of uncertainty had spooked one of the Hargrove Company's smaller institutional investors, a pension fund that had been skittish to begin with and had liquidated their position at a loss rather than wait for clarity. Local financial press had picked up the story in vague terms, describing the estate as contested and the company's transition as turbulent. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was uncomfortable. Patricia brought me the investor reports at our next meeting. The pension fund exit triggered a downgrade from one of the credit rating services, she said. Nothing severe, but it's noise, and noise matters. What's the actual damage? Minor, in terms of fundamentals. The company's operations haven't changed. Revenue is stable. The leadership team has been solid through this. She paused. The damage is perceptual. Victor's team is good at narrative. They're letting the market tell itself a story. I looked at the reports. Numbers on pages. I'm not a financial man by training, but I've been reading invoices and estimates and profit-loss statements for 30 years, and I understand the basic grammar of it. What's real and what's smoke. What would it take, I said slowly, to make the actual numbers public, not through press releases? Something that shows anyone who wants to look exactly what the company's position is. Revenue, contracts, operational stability, all of it. Patricia looked at me. A voluntary transparency disclosure. Companies aren't required to do that at this level, but they can. She paused. It's unusual. It might read as defensive. Or it might read as a majority owner who has nothing to hide and is tired of letting other people's narratives substitute for facts, I said. She considered that. I'll draft it, she said. The disclosure went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, 2 of the 3 institutional investors who had been quietly considering their positions had recommitted. Carol Jeffries called me and said, "Good move, Holloway," which from Carol was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The legal challenge was withdrawn 4 days later. No explanation offered. Victor's attorneys simply filed a withdrawal notice, clean and quiet. The way people retreat when they've realized the ground they're standing on has changed. I found out later, through Sandra Ortega, who had continued tracking Ashcroft's financial disclosures, that the morning after the withdrawal, 3 of Victor's larger institutional investors had requested emergency meetings with his board. The voluntary disclosure had prompted someone, maybe several someones, to look more carefully at the gap between Victor's public position and his actual debt structure. The questions they were asking were not comfortable ones. I didn't engineer that. I want to be clear about that. I made a decision about transparency because it was the right thing to do for the company and the people who worked there and depended on it. What that decision inadvertently illuminated about the man who had been trying to take it, that wasn't strategy. That was just light behaving the way light behaves when you let it in. But I won't pretend I was unhappy about it. The call I hadn't expected came from Lydia, not Evan. Lydia. She called on a Friday morning. I was at the shop. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. She was calling from a personal cell, not the one I had listed. But something made me pick up. "Mr. Holloway." Her voice was controlled. Lydia Ashcroft was always controlled. It was one of the things about her I'd found admirable in a detached sort of way, even when that control had been directed at keeping me at a comfortable distance. "I know you have no reason to take this call. I'm grateful that you did." I waited. "I'm not calling on Victor's behalf," she said. "I want to be clear about that. He doesn't know I'm calling." A pause. "I'm calling because Evan has barely slept in 3 weeks. He isn't eating properly. He's not doing well." Her voice held steady, but I could hear the effort it cost her. "I know that what happened between you is his responsibility. I'm not trying to redirect that. I know what I saw at the Meridian, and I know what part my family played in it." The last part came out with a weight that told me it hadn't been easy to say. I didn't make it easier, but I listened. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said. "I'm not asking you to forgive or to reconcile or to do anything you don't want to do. I'm asking you—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I'm asking you if there's any version of this where you'd be willing to at least let him try. Not for Victor, not for me, for him." I sat with that for a long time. "Lydia," I said finally, "I hear what you're telling me, and I believe you that this is coming from somewhere real." I paused. "But your husband made a choice in front of 400 people, and then he made a worse one in private. And I've spent a lot of years driving 4 hours for people who needed me and getting handed an empty seat in return. I can't keep doing that." I kept my voice steady. "If Evan wants to try, genuinely try, on his own terms because he's decided who he wants to be, then I'm not going to close that door permanently. But I need it to be his decision, not a strategy, not a reaction to business pressure. His." I paused. "Can you understand the difference?" Silence. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can." We ended the call. I sat in the back office for a while, at the blue desk, with the sounds of the shop around me, the compressor, the radio, the particular unremarkable music of a life I'd built with my hands. Victor Ashcroft's board was meeting in 6 days. Sandra Ortega had told me that morning that 2 of the institutional investors had formally requested an independent audit of Ashcroft Capital's debt obligations, the kind of request that, once made, could not be quietly unmade. Evan was not sleeping. Lydia was making phone calls in secret, and a man who had used my name as a punchline to make 400 people laugh was about to discover that the thing he thought he'd taken from an unguarded position had been, in fact, very carefully guarded indeed. I thought about Margaret, about the gutters and the letter, and a woman who had watched quietly for 40 years and reached her conclusions. I hoped, wherever she was, she felt that her conclusions had been correct. I picked up my coffee, which had gone cold while I was on the phone, and I drank it anyway. Some days that's all you can do. The independent audit request moved faster than anyone expected. Sandra Ortega called me on a Monday morning. I was pulling into the shop, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, and she said, "The two institutional investors didn't file separately. They coordinated, filed a joint petition to the Ashcroft Capital Board demanding a forensic review of the debt disclosures. They cited material inconsistencies between the Q3 earnings summary and the underlying covenant documentation." A brief pause. "Graham, that kind of coordinated action from institutional investors doesn't stay quiet. This is going to be in the financial press within 48 hours. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with the engine off. How bad is it for him? Depends on what the audit finds. If his books are just aggressive, creative accounting, optimistic projections, he survives it damaged. If there's actual misrepresentation in what he disclosed to investors..." She stopped. Let the implication finish itself. "What does your gut say?" A pause that told me more than words would have. "My gut says the creative accounting is the floor, not the ceiling." I thanked her and went inside and opened the shop and started my day, because that's what you do when you don't have control over a situation. You control the things you can control. Pete Tanner came in at 9 with a noise in his rear differential. I diagnosed it in 20 minutes. We talked about the weather. I charged him fair, but underneath the ordinary surface of the morning, something was moving. Something I had not engineered and had not planned for and could not stop. The natural consequence of a man building too much on borrowed ground and then leaning on it too hard. The financial press picked it up in 36 hours, not 48. A business journal with a Columbus bureau ran a piece on Tuesday afternoon. Ashcroft Capital faces investor scrutiny amid debt transparency questions. The piece was careful, the kind of careful that signals a journalist sitting on more than they're printing while lawyers decide what can be published. It described the joint petition in neutral terms. It quoted a financial analyst characterizing Ashcroft's recent acquisition attempts as aggressive positioning at a moment when the underlying balance sheet may not support the risk profile. Victor's communications team put out a statement within 2 hours. Confident language. Words like routine inquiry, and full cooperation and strong fundamentals. The language of a man who has given statements before and knows how to sound calm. What the statement didn't address was the shareholder meeting that had been quietly moved up by 2 weeks. Patricia found that out through her own network. One of the Hargrove Company's shareholders sat on a secondary board with someone in Ashcroft Capital's orbit. The meeting had been rescheduled under the pretext of calendar alignment, but the original date had been set 14 months in advance, and nobody moves a shareholder meeting without a reason. "They're going to try to get ahead of the audit findings," Patricia told me. "Present a restructuring plan before the independent review forces one. It's a control move. Victor wants to shape the narrative before someone else does." "Can he?" "If the board is still with him, maybe." She paused. But the fact that two institutional investors coordinated without telling him first suggests the board cohesion he's been relying on is fracturing. She said it the way you describe a crack in a foundation wall, factually, without satisfaction, because satisfaction is unprofessional. But I heard what was underneath it. There's something else. The Hargrove challenge. The legal filing Victor made contesting the estate transfer. The one they withdrew. Yes, Richard Cates has been reviewing the documentation from that filing. The procedural grounds they cited were specific, too specific in his view, to have been assembled in the time between the transfer completing and the challenge filing, which means someone was preparing that challenge before the transfer was public. She let that sit for a moment. Which means someone inside the transfer process, or close to it, was feeding Ashcroft Capital information about timing. I sat very still. "You're saying someone leaked?" "I'm saying the timeline doesn't add up otherwise." Her voice was careful. "Richard is going through the access logs. It's a small list of people who had visibility into the transfer schedule." I thought about that for the rest of the day. Thought about it while I replaced a water pump, and while I ate lunch at my desk, and while I locked up the shop at 6. I thought about who would have had reason to feed Victor Ashcroft information about an estate transfer involving a mechanic from Clover Falls who nobody should have been watching closely enough to bother with. The answer came to me at 2 in the morning, the way unwelcome answers do, arriving while you're trying to sleep, too clear to dismiss. The only person who had known in advance that I was going to that attorney's office was Evan. I had told him during the phone call, the one where he'd said he couldn't fix things with a phone call. I'd mentioned it offhandedly. I have a meeting in Columbus next week at an estate attorney's office. I hadn't said whose estate, but Evan was smart, and he knew Margaret Ellison's name from years of my passing references to her, and if he'd mentioned it to Victor, I didn't finish the thought. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and I made myself be fair. It was possible Evan hadn't understood the significance. It was possible he'd mentioned it casually, not as information being passed, but as a detail shared in the ordinary way families share things. It was possible he had not known what Victor would do with it. It was possible. I wasn't sure I believed it. Richard Cates called me the following Thursday. He had reviewed every access point in the transfer process. The leak had not come from his office, or from Patricia's, or from any of the administrators managing the operational companies. The information that had seeded Victor's legal challenge, the specific procedural timeline that had been too detailed to have been assembled from public sources, had come through a secondary channel. A phone inquiry to one of the county clerk's offices made by someone representing themselves as a family member of the deceased. The name they had given was not Evans. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But the inquiry had been made 3 days after my phone call with Evan. I'm not going to tell you how I felt about that. I think you already know. I think if you've been listening to this story, you understand exactly what it does to you when you have to look at evidence that the person you love most in the world may have, even accidentally, even thoughtlessly, handed the tools of harm to someone who was already aiming at you. What I will tell you is what I did with it. I called Evan. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for a call he knew might come. That told me something too. Did you tell Victor about the attorney's office? I asked. No preamble, no cushioning. A silence that lasted 4 full seconds. Dad? Evan? Yes or no? I mentioned... He stopped. I mentioned that you had a meeting with an estate attorney. I didn't understand what it meant. I thought it was routine. I thought maybe Margaret had left you something small. I wasn't... His voice was fraying at the edges. Dad, I swear I didn't know he would... But you told him. A long pause. Yes, he said, very quiet. I told him. I breathed in, out. Okay, I said. Dad, I'm sorry. I know you are, I said. But being sorry doesn't reach back and undo the thing. You know that. I kept my voice level. I am proud of that, still. Victor used what you told him to try to strip away something a woman left me because she trusted me. That's what your information was used for. I need you to sit with that. He didn't say anything. I could hear him breathing. I'm not going to shut this door, I said. But I need you to understand something clearly, Evan. You have to decide which side of a line you're standing on. Not because I'm threatening you, because you can't straddle it indefinitely without it costing you things you haven't calculated yet. I paused. You already know what it cost you once. I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table in the specific quiet of a house where only one person lives. The refrigerator hummed. Rusty appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation, and came and sat on the chair beside me, which was as close as he got to comfort on difficult nights. The shareholder meeting was held on a Friday in downtown Columbus, in a conference center attached to one of the financial district's larger hotels. I attended not in the room itself. I had no standing as a shareholder of Ashcroft Capital, but in an adjacent meeting room that Patricia had arranged, connected to the proceedings through Richard Cates, who did have standing as an attorney of record in the estate litigation that Ashcroft had initiated. I want to explain why this matters. When Victor had filed his legal challenge to Margaret's estate transfer, he had opened a door that he couldn't fully close with a withdrawal notice. The filing had put the estate's documentation, including the chain of ownership for the companies he'd been targeting, into a formal legal record. Richard had prepared a comprehensive rebuttal package for that challenge, and when the challenge was withdrawn, that package didn't disappear. It existed, fully prepared, detailed, precise. Richard had quietly shared the relevant portions with Ashcroft Capital's board counsel as part of the settlement of the withdrawn challenge. Standard legal procedure. Both parties receive documentation when a filing is closed. What Victor's legal team had apparently not read carefully enough was what those documents established about the history of Margaret's ownership, the duration and legitimacy of the company structures, and the complete absence of any procedural grounds for the challenge they had filed. What they had also apparently not considered was what Carol Jeffries had been doing for the past 3 weeks. Carol, it turned out, had a relationship with 2 members of Ashcroft Capital's board. Not a warm relationship, a professional one, the kind built over years of business intersections. When the institutional investor scrutiny began, Carol had reached out to both of them with a simple request. She wanted them to see the complete documentation from the estate transfer process, including Victor's challenge filing and Richard's rebuttal, before they made any decisions about restructuring or leadership. She hadn't asked me before she did it. I found out after the fact when she called me on a Thursday evening and told me matter-of-factly what she'd done. "Carol," I said slowly, "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know you didn't," she said, "but Margaret would have. And since she can't, I did it for her." A pause. "Those board members deserve to know that the man they've been backing just tried to legally invalidate a dead woman's final wishes because he wanted to take what she built. That's character information. People deserve to make decisions with accurate character information." I sat with that for a moment. And, Carol said with a satisfaction she didn't try to hide, "They are both attending the shareholder meeting tomorrow with a set of questions that Victor is going to find very uncomfortable." I learned what happened in that meeting room through Richard, who gave me a precise, methodical account that evening over the phone. He was not a dramatic man. He reported what occurred with the same calibrated evenness he brought to everything, but even through that measured delivery, I could hear the weight of what he was describing. Victor had opened the meeting with the prepared restructuring narrative, the controlled story about proactive strategic adjustment, temporary market headwinds, a management decision to streamline certain acquisition activities in response to a shifting interest rate environment. He was good at it. Victor Ashcroft had been managing rooms for decades. He knew how to fill space with confidence and make people feel that doubt was their own failure of understanding rather than a reasonable response to incomplete information. The first board member, one of Carol's contacts, had waited until the prepared remarks were complete. Then he had placed a document on the table, Richard's rebuttal package, specifically the section that laid out the timeline of Victor's legal challenge against Margaret's estate, the filing date, the specific procedural claims, and the evidence that the challenge had been prepared before the estate transfer was public record. He asked Victor directly, Richard told me, whether he had attempted to obtain non-public information about a pending estate transfer in order to structure a legal challenge against it. I said nothing. I waited. Victor said the challenge had been based on publicly available information and standard due diligence. Richard paused. The second board member then presented the county clerk's inquiry record, the one showing a call made 3 days after your conversation with your son by someone representing themselves as a family member of the deceased. I closed my eyes briefly. How did he respond? He said he was not familiar with the specific outreach and that his team managed acquisition research independently. Richard's tone remained neutral. The board member then asked whether Victor considered misrepresenting oneself to a county clerk's office as part of an acquisition strategy to be consistent with the firm's stated ethical governance commitments. The room had gone very quiet, Richard said. The kind of quiet that happens when a question has no good answer, and everyone present understands that simultaneously. Victor had not answered directly. He had said the matter was a peripheral operational detail, and he would address it separately. He had tried to redirect to the restructuring plan. The board had voted to table the restructuring plan pending the completion of the independent audit. They had also voted 6-3, not unanimous, nothing is ever clean, to establish an independent oversight committee with authority to review all major strategic decisions during the audit period, effective immediately. Victor had remained in the room for the duration. He was too practiced to leave. But Richard said that at some point in the second hour, watching the vote tallies, something in his face had changed. Some fundamental shift in the particular confidence he carried like weather around him. A man realizing that the room had changed without him noticing, that the ground he was standing on was not the ground he thought it was. I understood that feeling, actually. I had felt its cousin at a dinner table in the Meridian when a man used my name to make people laugh. The specific, clarifying shock of the world showing you your actual position rather than the one you'd assumed. The difference was what you did with the information. Evan came to Clover Falls on a Saturday. He didn't call ahead. He just drove. I found out later that he'd left Columbus at 6 in the morning, which meant he'd been awake before that, which meant he probably hadn't slept much. He pulled into the shop parking lot at 9:45, which was when I was midway through a brake job on a Subaru that belonged to a teacher named Mike who needed it done by Monday. I heard the car. I didn't know it was him until I walked out front and saw him standing next to a vehicle I didn't recognize. A different car than the one he'd been driving when I'd visited the Columbus house. Newer, the kind of car that came with his current life. He was in jeans and a plain jacket, not the pressed office clothes I'd seen him in at the Meridian. He looked like he hadn't shaved in several days. He looked, honestly, like he'd been through something. He stood there in the parking lot with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at the shop, at the sign above the door that said Holloway's Engine and Repair in letters I'd painted myself 22 years ago, and then he looked at me. "I'm not here because of the shareholder meeting," he said. First thing out of his mouth, like he'd been rehearsing that sentence for 4 hours of driving. "I know how it looks. I know the timing looks like that. But I need you to know that's not why I'm here." I looked at my son's face, the unshaven jaw, the eyes that were his mother's eyes, which I'd forgotten until this moment, the specific shape of them, the brown of them. 3 years of increasing distance, and still his mother's eyes. "Come inside," I said. We sat in the back office. I made coffee on the small machine I kept for long days. I didn't give him the blue chair. That was mine. He sat in the metal folding chair across the desk, the one customers sat in when we went over estimates. He held his coffee with both hands the same way I held mine, which I noticed and didn't comment on. "I told Victor about the attorney's office," he said. "I already admitted that, but I need to tell you the fuller version, because I think you deserve the fuller version." I waited. "He asked me how you were doing," Evan said. "After the Meridian. He brought it up himself about 2 weeks later in a way that it seemed like concern. He said he'd been thinking about it, that maybe he'd been too harsh, that family was complicated." He stopped, looked at his coffee. "I told him you seemed okay, that you'd mentioned a meeting with an estate attorney. I said it exactly like that. I made it sound like nothing, because to me it was nothing. I didn't know about Margaret. I didn't know the scale of it." He looked up. "But here's the part I've been sitting with." When I told him, his face changed, just for a second, and something in me noticed it and then immediately decided not to notice it because noticing it would have meant having to think about what it meant. The room was quiet. "I let myself not notice," he said. "That's the thing I have to live with. Not that I didn't know. That I chose not to." I looked at my son for a long time, at the 3 years of distance in his face and the 2 months of reckoning and the specific difficult quality of a person telling the truth about themselves in a way that makes them look worse, not better. "That took something," I said finally, "to say that." "It's the least I could do," he said. "It's the absolute minimum." He met my eyes. "Dad, I know I don't get to just walk back in. I know this isn't a conversation that fixes things. I'm not here for that." He swallowed. "I'm here because I needed you to see me trying, not for what it gets me. Just, I needed to do it." I drank my coffee. Outside, through the thin wall, I could hear the sounds of the shop, the compressor, the radio. The ordinary. "The man you were before Lydia," I said slowly. "The one who called on Sundays. The one who drove home when his mother was in the hospital even though you had exams the next day. The one who once loaned his last $40 to a coworker he barely knew because the guy needed gas money to get to a funeral." I looked at him. "That man is not gone, Evan. He made bad choices. He let someone else's confidence become his compass. That happens to people. I set down my cup. But you don't rebuild that by making one trip to Clover Falls. You know that. I know, he said. You rebuild it by deciding what you're going to do next, about Victor, about the kind of work you're willing to put your name on, about who you're going to be when things are hard and there's no upside in being decent. I paused. That's not a conversation for today. That's a conversation for after you've made some of those decisions, and I can see what they look like. He nodded. Not happily. Not with the relief of someone who's been let off the hook. With the particular gravity of someone who understands they're being held to something real. Is there anything, he started, is there anything I can do right now? Something concrete? I thought about it honestly. Go home, I said. Talk to Lydia. The real version, not the managed version. Figure out what you actually want your life to look like when you're not standing next to Victor Ashcroft's money. I paused. And maybe call her more, Lydia. She made a phone call for you that she didn't have to make. He looked surprised. She called you? She was worried about you, I said. Whatever else she was worried about you. That's not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face, softer, in a way that looked a little fragile. Okay, he said. He left an hour later. I walked him to his car. At the edge of the parking lot, he stopped and turned around, and for a second he looked younger than he'd looked in years. Not in a good way exactly, but in an honest way. Like something performed had been set down. Dad? He said. Yeah. I'm sorry I let you sit at table 14. I looked at him. I let the words land where they were supposed to land, without deflecting them. I know you are, I said. I watched him drive away. I stood in the parking lot for a while after his car disappeared, with the October air coming in cold off the flat Ohio fields, and I thought about my wife, about what she would have said about all of this, standing beside me in the same parking lot, with her practical wisdom and her absolute refusal to let me simplify things I needed to sit with. She would have said, "Don't forgive too fast and don't close too hard. Both of those are about you, not him." She was almost always right. I went back inside. I finished Mike's breaks. I swept the floor. I fed Rusty and locked up and drove home in the dark on roads I knew so well I could drive them half asleep. Victor Ashcroft's independent audit was underway. His board had installed oversight above him. His institutional investors were asking questions he didn't have clean answers to. The empire he had built on borrowed ground, and reflected confidence was beginning, slowly, to show what it was actually made of. And I was driving home to Clover Falls with grease under my fingernails and a dead woman's trust on my shoulders, and something that felt, for the first time in months, almost like solid ground beneath my feet. Not peace. Not yet. Too much still unsettled for peace. But something real. Something that was mine. And after everything, after the Meridian and the silent phone and the empty seat at table 14, something that was mine was more than enough to keep going. The audit took 11 weeks. Graham knew it was finished before Patricia called him, the way you sometimes know a weather system has shifted before you step outside. Something in the quality of the silence, a change in pressure you can't quite name. He was at the shop on a Tuesday morning in late January, working alone because he'd given the two part-time guys the day off, when his phone rang and Patricia's voice came through with that particular evenness she used when the news was large enough to require steadiness around it. "The independent auditors filed their report this morning," she said. "I have the summary. Do you want the long version or the short one?" "Short first," Graham said. He set down the wrench he was holding. Victor Ashcroft misrepresented the collateral structure on 3 major debt instruments to institutional investors. The misrepresentation was not accidental. The documentation shows deliberate omission of covenant obligations that materially affected the risk profile investors were shown. A pause. The board removed him from his position as CEO this morning, effective immediately. The Securities and Exchange Commission has been notified. There will be an investigation. Graham stood in the middle of his shop floor. Around him, everything was the same. The lift, the compressor, the smell of oil and cold metal, Rusty asleep on the parts catalog. Everything exactly the same. "And the company?" he asked. "The people who work there?" Ashcroft Capital as an entity is being restructured under new board leadership. The operating subsidiaries, including the ones that were never his to begin with, are unaffected. Patricia paused. Your companies are fine, Graham. Your people are fine. He exhaled. That was the part that mattered. The rest of it, Victor's removal, the SEC referral, the collapse of the carefully maintained image, that was consequence, not victory. Graham had understood the difference for a while now. Thank you, Patricia, he said, for everything. Margaret chose well, she said, which was the closest Patricia Voss ever came to sentiment, and Graham received it accordingly. But what happened to Victor Ashcroft over the following months was not dramatic in the way public falls sometimes are. It was methodical and grinding and largely played out in regulatory filings and legal correspondence rather than headlines, which was perhaps a fitting end for a man who had always operated in the gap between what was visible and what was true. The SEC investigation proceeded. Two of his former board members, not the ones Carol Jeffries had reached, the loyal ones who had stayed with him until the end, retained their own counsel and cooperated with investigators, which accelerated the timeline considerably. The personal debt guarantees he had made came due and could not be serviced once the institutional capital withdrew. The real estate positions unwound at losses. The private equity fund, whose investors had been shown projections built on the same selectively presented information, filed a civil suit. Victor sold the house, the one Graham had never seen but had imagined correctly as the kind of house that announces its owner's self-regard from the street, to cover a portion of the legal settlements. He moved with Miriam to a smaller property in a suburb Graham had never heard of. The silver hair and the arranged expression and the practiced way of filling rooms presumably went with him, though nobody Graham knew reported seeing them anymore. Graham did not track Victor's decline with any satisfaction. He knew this about himself and felt it was worth examining. When he looked for triumph in what had happened, he didn't find it. What he found instead was something quieter, a kind of completion, like a sentence reaching its period. The man had done what he'd done, and the consequences had arrived, and that was as much as the world owed anyone in terms of justice. Graham didn't need to feel good about it. He just needed to move on. What was harder to move on from was Evan. 10. The months after the audit passed in a way Graham hadn't expected. Evan didn't disappear. He didn't flood Graham with apologies either, which was actually the more meaningful thing. What he did was call every 2 weeks, not every Sunday, not yet, but consistently, without prompting, at irregular times that suggested the calls were genuine rather than scheduled. He talked about ordinary things. Work, which had changed. He'd left the firm connected to Victor's network and taken a position with a smaller regional operation that paid him less and required him to start over in terms of standing. He talked about Lydia, who was, and this surprised Graham the first time Evan said it, attending therapy. Something about the last year had rattled something loose in her, some understanding about what she had accepted and what she had asked Evan to accept, and she was working on it, not cleanly, not without friction, but working. Graham listened to all of this and said reasonable things and did not rush toward warmth he hadn't yet earned back the right to feel. He was honest with himself about where he was, not closed, not open, somewhere in the careful middle ground of a man who has been hurt badly enough that optimism feels like a risk he needs to manage. In March, Evan asked if he could come to Clover Falls again. Graham said yes. This visit was different from the October one. There was less urgency, less of the frantic quality of a man trying to outrun his own conscience. Evan arrived on a Saturday afternoon and they went to the diner, the one on Main Street with the meatloaf on Thursdays and a Saturday special that was reliably decent. And they sat in a booth and ate and talked for 2 hours. Evan asked about the companies. Graham told him, in the broad terms he used with everyone, that things were stable, that the people who worked there were good people and doing well. He talked about Carol Jeffries, whose directness Evan found both intimidating and admirable when Graham described her. He talked about Patricia and Richard and Sandra, the team that had formed around Margaret's legacy without planning to, each of them drawn in by the weight of what she'd built and the integrity of how she'd built it. She sounds extraordinary, Evan said, about Margaret. She was, Graham said. You would have liked her. She had very little patience for nonsense, which I think she and you would have found mutually clarifying. Evan looked at him across the table, something careful in his expression. Is that your way of saying I'm full of nonsense? I'm saying you were, Graham said. Past tense, the present tense I'm still watching. Evan nodded. He picked up his coffee, set it down. That's fair, he said. I know it is, Graham said. Not unkindly. They paid the check and walked back through Clover Falls in the cold March air, past the hardware store and the pharmacy and the VFW hall with its faded banner. Graham walked these streets the way you walk places you've lived long enough that the geography is part of how you think, automatically, with the specific comfort of deep familiarity. I used to be embarrassed by this town, Evan said quietly, at one point. Not apologetically exactly. More like a confession offered without expectation. I know, Graham said. I don't know when that happened. Somewhere in the middle of learning to want different things. He looked at the street around them. It's a good town. It's always been a good town, Graham said. You just stopped being able to see it for a while. They parted in the shop parking lot with a handshake that was slightly awkward because both of them were aware that a handshake was both too formal and not quite enough, and neither of them was ready for something else yet. But it was honest. And honest counted for more than smooth. Graham watched his son drive away, again, on the same road going back to Columbus. It hurt less than October. Not because the wound was gone, wounds like that don't disappear, they just change texture over time. But because October had been about what was lost, and March was beginning, tentatively, to be about what was possible. That was something. Not everything, but something real. In April, Graham did what he had been thinking about since the afternoon he'd first sat in Richard Cates's conference room and understood what Margaret had left him and why. He established a foundation. He didn't name it after himself. He didn't name it after Margaret either, though he considered it. He decided she would have found the gesture embarrassing, and he was probably right. He called it the Ellison Holloway Community Trust, which was the kind of name that meant something to the people who needed to know what it meant, and nothing to people who were just looking for a label. The work the trust funded was specific and unglamorous, which was intentional. Scholarships for students at two-year technical colleges and trade programs in Central Ohio, because Graham believed, had always believed, in the bone-deep way of a man who had built a life with his hands, that the dignity of skilled work was systematically undervalued, and the people who chose it deserved support. Small business grants for people trying to build something in communities like Clover Falls. Not startup glamour, not tech-forward ventures, but the hardware stores and auto shops and family diners that formed the actual connective tissue of ordinary American life. And a housing initiative targeted at elderly residents facing displacement from rising costs, because Graham had held Margaret's letter in his hands and read her words about resources being a form of justice. And he understood that the most vulnerable people were the ones who had worked their whole lives and still found the world shifting under them. He didn't announce any of it publicly. A press release went out, Patricia insisted, and she was right. But Graham did not give interviews, and he did not appear in photographs, and he did not go to any of the small ceremonies that were organized by the grant recipients. He sent Carol Jeffries to the ones that required someone present, because Carol had the right combination of warmth and no-nonsense practicality, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy them. You should come to one, Carol told him, on the phone, after a grant ceremony for a family opening a hardware store in a small town 40 minutes from Clover Falls. The Garcias, nice people, 3 kids. The father worked at a big box store for 12 years saving up for this. He cried when we gave him the grant letter. I'm glad it went well, Graham said. Graham. Her voice had a different quality. Margaret built this so it would be used. Not managed from a distance. You're allowed to be part of it. He thought about that for a while. It was the kind of thing that felt presumptuous, showing up to witness what your money had made possible, like expecting credit for rain. But Carol's point was different, and he knew it. It wasn't about credit. It was about being present in your own life, being part of something rather than administering it. He went to the next one, a scholarship ceremony at a community college 40 miles from Clover Falls. 6 students, all of them in trade or technical programs, all of them sitting in folding chairs in a community room with a banner that was slightly crooked on one end. He sat in the back. He didn't introduce himself as anything other than Graham. One of the students, a young woman named Priya who was in her second year of an HVAC certification program and had the particular focused energy of someone who had decided exactly what she wanted and was going after it without drama, gave a short speech about what the scholarship had meant to her family. She talked about her grandmother who had told her that the only things nobody could take from you were what you knew and who you were. She said the scholarship had let her stop working the third job that had been making it hard to study, which meant she was getting better grades, which meant she was going to finish on time, which meant she was going to be able to take care of her family the way she'd planned. Graham sat in the back row of that community room, and he listened to Priya talk about her grandmother, and he thought about Margaret, about gutters and birthday cards, and a letter he still kept in the drawer of the blue desk in his shop. He thought about a woman who had watched quietly for 40 years and left him something large enough to reach people she would never meet. He didn't cry, but it was close. Evan and Lydia came to Clover Falls together in June, which was the first time Lydia had been there. Graham made dinner, nothing elaborate, the chicken and rice dish his wife had taught him that was one of the few things he made reliably well. And they ate at the kitchen table where he'd opened the attorney's letter 2 seasons ago and where he'd sat with Rusty on the hard nights, and where his wife had once spread out the plans for the garden she never quite finished planting. It was not a comfortable dinner exactly. There was too much history in the room for it to be comfortable. Lydia was formal at first, the practiced social ease she'd grown up with providing a surface where her actual uncertainty lived underneath. But somewhere in the second hour, after the food was cleared and Graham had made coffee, and Rusty had decided to sit on Lydia's feet, which was unusual enough that everyone acknowledged it, and which seemed to break something loose in the atmosphere, she said something that Graham hadn't expected. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not to Evan, to Graham. Not for Victor. That's his to own. But for what I allowed to happen. At the Meridian." Evan wasn't the only one who stayed silent. Graham looked at his daughter-in-law. She was holding her coffee cup with both hands, the same way Evan held his, the same way Graham held his, which was either coincidence or something you absorbed from the people close to you without meaning to. "I know you are," he said, "and I accept that." He paused. "What I'm more interested in is what comes after it, both of you. What the next few years look like. Not in terms of us, but in terms of who you're deciding to be." Lydia nodded slowly. "We've been talking about that," she said. "A lot, actually." She glanced at Evan in a way that confirmed that the therapy wasn't just hers, that somewhere in the last several months it had become something they were doing together, imperfectly, with friction, but together. "We've been talking about moving, smaller city. Evan has a standing offer from a firm in Dayton. We'd have to start over in a lot of ways." "Are you going to take it?" Graham asked Evan. Evan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I think so," he said. "Yeah, I think so." He looked up. "The firm we'd be leaving, it's mostly Victor's old network. People who've spent the last year trying to position themselves as far from him as possible without actually examining why they were close to him in the first place." He shook his head. "I don't want to be in that room anymore." Graham nodded. He didn't say good or "I'm proud of you" or anything that would have given the moment a resolution it hadn't quite earned. He just nodded and let it be what it was. A decision being made, on its own terms, without any guarantee of how it would land. That was real. More real than any smooth conclusion. After they left, Graham sat at the kitchen table for a while. The dishes were done. Rusty was on his chair. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 3 years. The same quiet, but different now. Changed in some quality he couldn't entirely name. He was not a man who arrived at happiness easily or announced it when he did. That wasn't how he was built. But sitting at that table on a June evening with the window open and the smell of the neighbor's garden coming through and the remains of a dinner that had been complicated, honest, real, he felt something that was close enough to peace that the difference didn't matter. Margaret had been right about something, in the end, that Graham had been slow to understand. She'd said the resources were not for him, that doing it for himself wouldn't be enough. He'd accepted that as instruction and followed it in the obvious ways. The trust, the scholarships, the housing initiative. But she'd meant something else too, something underneath the practical direction, which was this, that receiving something is its own form of courage. That a man who had spent 63 years believing that men like him don't get to have things, respect, legacy, the weight of something worth carrying, had to actively choose to let that belief be wrong, had to decide every day to inhabit the life that had been handed to him instead of managing it from a distance, administering it with the careful remove of someone who still doesn't quite believe he belongs in it. Graham was working on that. He would be working on it for the rest of his life, probably. He was not a man who transformed. He was a man who adjusted, slowly, with resistance, in the direction of something better. The shop remained open. He had no interest in closing it, not because he needed the money, which he didn't, but because he needed the work. The particular, irreplaceable honesty of a problem that had a solution, of a thing broken that could be fixed with knowledge and time and the right tools applied with enough patience. He kept Pete Tanner's trucks running. He kept Donna Rhea's Tupperware on the shelf. He kept Rusty fat and comfortable and fully convinced that he ran the operation, which, honestly, he might have. He drove the same truck. He pressed the same suit once a year for the scholarship ceremony and sat in the back and listened. He called Carol Jeffries on Tuesdays because she was the most direct person he'd met since Margaret, and that kind of directness was good for him. She complained about the logistics of the housing initiative, and he told her she was complaining too much, and she told him to come do it himself then, and they both understood this was their version of friendship. Evan called every 2 weeks, sometimes every week. It was not yet the Sunday calls of the before time. It was its own thing, new-shaped, with gaps and imperfections, and the specific awkwardness of two people rebuilding something they'd broken without a blueprint for how. But it was real. That was what mattered about it. It was real, and it was consistent, and it was his son doing the work without expecting the work to be enough by itself. And that, Graham had decided, was what repair actually looked like. Not the apology, not the moment of acknowledgement in a diner or across a kitchen table. The accumulation of days after that, each one a small vote for the person you were trying to become. Most people wanted redemption to be an event, a scene, a conversation that closes the account. But the account doesn't close. You just keep making deposits, and over time, if you're honest and consistent and you don't quit when the progress is too small to see, something changes. Slowly, unevenly. But it changes. Victor Ashcroft had believed that everything could be purchased or leveraged or controlled through the right application of power and positioning. He had believed that a man without money was a man without standing, and that standing was the only thing that mattered. He had spent decades constructing a version of himself that was enormous and impervious. And when the foundation cracked, there was nothing underneath it but debt and fear and a boardroom full of people who had never actually trusted him. They'd only been positioned near him. Graham Holloway had nothing like that. He had a shop and a cat and a folded suit and a dead woman's faith and a son who was trying. He had Carol Jeffries and Patricia Voss and a scholarship recipient named Priya who was going to finish her certification on time and take care of her family the way she'd planned. He had his hands and his work and 63 years of knowing exactly who he was, even when nobody with money was watching. He had always had that. It turned out it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.